Hello and welcome back. We're continuing our discussion of biological theories of crime. This is part 2 of 3-part video on chapter 3 from Frank Smallinger's text, Criminology, 3rd edition, Pearson Education. So we left off with twin studies, looking at, actually we didn't get into twin studies, we're about to get into twin studies. We left off with genetics and looking down the road at how various characteristics were passed along. We looked at so-called criminal families, looked at the Jukes and the Kallikaks, and how it was believed that certain traits could be passed along, and therefore there were people who had ideas, an idea called eugenics, that suggested that maybe we should not allow the certain people to reproduce. Now, probably the largest or the grossest or the scariest use of something similar to eugenics was Adolf Hitler during the Second World War and the years before, in his attempt to annihilate or eliminate Jews from the face of the earth in what they called the final solution. Here you had, at the time, he considered himself part of a so-called master race, and Jews were inferior. And we've heard that talk about other people, races, and ethnicities throughout history, where people thought that certain folks or certain people were inferior. We hear that in our own history in this country about African Americans. Hopefully not too much today, but that legacy still carries on. And there are certainly some people still in this country that have that idea that certain groups of people are inferior. And that's a scary thought, because we're all human. We all have, the scientist hasn't arrived yet to really prove that any race is superior or inferior to another. Certainly we have individuals with issues that may have problems that you might consider them to be superior or inferior. Somebody who's really brilliant, who solved all kinds of problems with their brain, like Einstein or somebody like that, is definitely different from the rest of the people. But is the rest of his family the same way? Or sometimes you can see it. It appears that, the whole old statement, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, suggesting that someone similar to a parent or another family member. But as we'll see later on in our study of crime and the study of these various theories, is it always the biological issue? Is it the criminal families that are passing along things? Or is it also the environmental issue? Because if you have someone in a family who is exposed to negative behaviors and watches these behaviors and they become accustomed to those behaviors, is it because it was in their genes, or because that's what they saw? That's the old argument of nature versus nurture, which we're going to address later on. So let's move on with the slide deck, getting into some more modern biological explanations of crime. And your book picks this up on or about page 50, where we left off with eugenics. Sorry for the delay. Should have had this up already. So our first well-known study of the modern era, if you will, was done by Patricia Jacobs in 1965, and there were some findings of unusual chromosomes among the people that she studied. Chromosome issues or genetic issues later identified in the 60s as some guys or men were called super males because they had an extra Y chromosome. So they're known as XYY. I like to call it the extra Y. Try to remember that. One very well-known person, and we showed a video in class the other night and I gave you the link for that, was a Richard Speck, who was believed to be XYY. Later testing found out he wasn't. They were looking at his body type, tall, large, I think big hands, and thought that he might be one of these people, but it turned out he wasn't. And he was responsible for the murder, I believe, like 8 or 9 nursing students in the Chicago area in the 60s. As I said, we watched a YouTube video documentary that had been posted on YouTube about him, and which was also incredibly interesting. So I can post a link for that if I haven't done that already. Another condition which hasn't really been identified as related to crime was the XXY male. It's called Klinefelter syndrome. It's mentioned in your book. Is basically you have men that have male genitalia but frequently are sterile, and also may have enlarged breasts. This is a natural occurring thing. This is not with additional hormones, as you might see. It's just a naturally occurring chromosomal issue. So let's get on with the twin studies. So we have what you call dizygotic twins, or DZ twins. They're what we also known as fraternal twins. So you have 2 eggs, and then you have the monozygotic twins, or MZ, which is where you have 1 egg involved. So there are a lot of studies, and they still do studies with twins and watching how twins develop, whether they're living together or in different environments. And they found a lot of interesting things with regard to that. So they're looking at the role of heredity in determining behavior. DZ, or fraternal twins, carry genetic material like siblings. So if you are a fraternal twin, you have you're as likely to be similar to your twin as you are to your non-twin brother or sister. MZ, or identical twins, have virtually the same genetic material. That's why they're identical. They're like, everything's the same. What they found in studies is that both the DZ and the MZ twins have similar behaviors, but the MZ, or monozygotic or identical twins, are more likely. And some of these studies were done where they were able to find twins that grew up in different households. Maybe both were given up for adoption and separated at birth, and they were able to find that they behaved very similarly in different environments. So that gave rise to an understanding that yes, there is some connection between genetics and behavior. All right, I want to look at how social biology views crime, importance of altruism, territoriality, and tribalism from that perspective. Konrad Lorenz basically looked at animals and animal behavior and suggested that much of our human conduct is instinctive responses that are similar in all organisms. So what a lioness might do to protect her cubs, you have some people, they call the mama bear, who, the adult female protecting her children, similar things. Or you have the male of the species out on the hunt in a bar somewhere looking for females to reproduce with, just like an animal in the wild might do. That's the kind of stuff that Lorenz looked at. So that we all have these deeply rooted instinctive responses that we're going to find everywhere. Sociobiology, Edward O. Wilson coined this term in his book, the Sociobiology, the New Synthesis, and it was a systematic study of the biological basis of all social behavior. Some of the things that came out of this study and looking at these things are altruism. You have people that are very willing to help people, considered altruistic, people, selfless helping behavior. And the people do that, according to Wilson, to ensure the society survives and the continuity of genetic material from one generation to the next. So the idea was that people were selfless in helping in order to perpetuate the species, perpetuate the passing along of genetic material, perpetuating the survival of that species. Territoriality, he explained, that's how you had the conflicts between and among species. Human beings, you might look at gangs today where you have a territory, you have a turf, and why there's fights between, or even countries, nationalist countries around the world, whether it be Europe or Africa or Asia or wherever, where countries are having disputes over territory. And again, we go back to the animal culture. Certain animals have their territory, and other animals of the same species are not permitted to hunt or live in those areas. And if one is found within those areas, then a fight will ensue, sometimes to the death. Well, you can certainly compare that to some of the behavior of gangs in our culture today, which of course then leads to certain types of crime. Tribalism, you have strong feelings of identification with one's own social group. Again, we can look at gangs as a really, really good example of tribalism, because you have identification with that group. We can also see that among certain races, ethnicities. On St. Paddy's Day, everybody's Irish, especially the Irish, and we're more prone to be celebrating that day. Columbus Day, you have the Italians out and having a parade. You have the Polish out in Pulaski Day parade. You may or may not call this tribalism, but you see strong feelings of identification with that ancestral group, if you will, or social group. But when we look at, and it doesn't necessarily mean that leads to crime, but now if you look at the gang culture, very good example. And you could probably look at other things in our society where that tribalism leads to problems. So hopefully this is working. This is pretty quick. This concludes part 2 of our look at biological theories of crime. The next segment, we're going to be looking at the critiques. You always have critiques. You always have people looking at these different ideas and say, yeah, that's nice, but what does it have to do with crime? Or, yeah, that's nice, but it doesn't talk about this aspect or that aspect. That's what we're going to be looking at next in part 3 of this 3-part series of chapter 3 on criminology.